once a woman marries, she's no longer family. Celebrations are only for the family, so leave already. My sister Amy said this to me with a sneer, while my mother told me to hurry up and leave. I returned to celebrate my sister's coming-of-age ceremony, but my family treated me coldly. I never imagined they would act this way. At that moment, I realized I was nothing more than a stranger to them. My chest tightened, but I quickly collected myself. If that's how they feel, then there's only one thing I should do: make them regret their words. My name is Sherry. I'm 22 years old, and I've finally gotten used to living on my own. It's been 4 years since I left home. After graduating from a vocational high school, I worked hard to make ends meet. It's not a luxurious life, but it's the path I chose, and I'm happy to be supporting myself. Yet, every so often, memories from the past still haunt me. My mother and Amy's actions still cast a shadow over my heart. The day before my first birthday, my father left my mother for another woman. My mother never forgave him, and because I looked like him, she harbored a deep hatred toward me. "You're just like him. Seeing your face makes me sick." As a child, I didn't understand the meaning behind her words, but I could feel her cold stares and occasional disdain. To my mother, I was nothing but a source of resentment. My grandparents initially cared about me, but as my mother constantly asked them for money, they grew distant. Before I turned 2, my mother remarried. A year later, my sister Amy was born. My mother, stepfather, and Amy formed a new family. I was never treated as part of it. One day, I watched my mother, stepfather, and Amy pack suitcases. "Where are you going?" "On vacation." I wasn't told anything. "Can I come too?" "Of course not. We'll drop you off at daycare." Her mocking laughter still echoes in my mind. My mother never once took me on a family trip. Instead, I was left at a 24-hour daycare center. This happened every single time. Watching them leave happily filled me with loneliness. At home, my mother's rejection became more blatant. I was isolated, completely ignored by my so-called family. One day, Amy innocently asked my mother a question. "Why doesn't Sherry get a birthday party?" For a brief moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe my mother cared about me. "Celebrate her birthday. There's nothing to celebrate." Her words pierced my heart. From that day forward, Amy began to look down on me as well. During family celebrations, I was always pushed aside. Only Amy received birthday cakes. There was never one for me. As time passed, I entered high school. Even then, my family refused to pay for my education. I attended a vocational school and worked hard to support myself. Being outside working was better than staying home. But no matter how hard I tried, home was the only place to return to. My mother never acknowledged my efforts. At 18, I finally decided to leave. I couldn't take it anymore. I wanted freedom. Sharing space with my mother, stepfather, and Amy was unbearable. When I left, they showed no emotion. They even seemed relieved. "Do whatever you want. You're not our problem anymore." Those words severed my final emotional ties to them. Life on my own wasn't easy, but I felt free. For the first time, I experienced the joy of living for myself. But even now at 22, I can't entirely escape thoughts of my mother and Amy. Especially now that Amy's coming-of-age ceremony is approaching. My own coming-of-age ceremony was non-existent, but I'm sure Amy's will be extravagant. One day, I got an unexpected call from my mother. Hearing her voice after years made me tense. "Amy's 21st birthday is next week. You're not coming, right?" I was momentarily speechless. I never thought she'd contact me. Why would I? I wasn't invited. "Good. It'd be awkward if you showed up." Her words stabbed at me, leaving a heavy weight in my chest. I whispered to myself, of course I wouldn't go. But even as I said that, the suffocating feelings inside me didn't go away. I thought I had severed all ties with them. Why do they still affect me so much? I had chosen my own path, left my family behind, and yet their existence still lingers in my mind. I resolved not to let them control me anymore, but the past is hard to erase. Yet, as an adult, I felt a small desire to face them one more time. Especially Amy. She was about to turn 21, a significant milestone. Regardless of our history, I wanted to celebrate her. So, I bought a cake and a present and decided to visit my family for the first time in years. As I stood in front of the door, my heart raced. It had been years since I'd been here. Of course I was nervous. When I rang the doorbell, Amy answered with a mocking tone. "Who's there?" "Amy, it's me." "Stop joking. I brought a cake, so open the door." After a moment of silence, the door opened abruptly. Without a word, Amy snatched the cake box from my hands and threw it back at me. Shocked, I froze as the cake splattered across the floor. "What are you doing?" "I can't eat food from a stranger." A stranger? That word echoed in my mind. I knew I was an outsider, but hearing it from her lips hurt more than I expected. Somewhere deep inside, I had hoped she still saw me as her sister. The betrayal left me speechless. As I stared at the ruined cake, my mother appeared, laughing alongside Amy. "What were you thinking coming here? Did you just come to ruin things?" Her icy words filled me with regret. I should never have come. "Why is she even here? She's not family anymore." My heart sank deeper as I heard my stepfather's voice join in. "Celebrations are for family only. Strangers like you don't belong here." His words froze me in place. Family only? Am I not family? Why? My trembling voice barely escaped my lips. "Of course you're not family. We're not even related." Amy laughed at me. "Did you really think you were one of us?" Their words shattered me. I realized I had always been an outsider. There was nothing left for me here. My mother barked at me. "Clean up that mess before you leave." Numbly, I obeyed. As I cleaned, Amy and my mother-in-law laughed mockingly behind me. "She bought the cake, and now she's cleaning it up herself." "It's pathetic." Their laughter stung, but I focused on finishing quickly. When I was done, I silently headed for the door. "Leaving already? Should have never come, huh?" I didn't respond. As I opened the door, Amy called out behind me. "Don't come back, stranger." Her words echoed in my mind as I stepped outside. The door slammed shut behind me, like the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. I realized I had been clinging to a false hope that something might change. But I was wrong. I am nothing but a stranger to them. Maybe I always was. But I don't need to waste any more time trying to find my place in their lives. I already have a place where I belong. My husband, Don, is waiting for me at home. I met Don through a mutual friend, and it changed my life. At first, I never thought I would get married. I didn't believe I deserved a family of my own. But Don accepted me as I was. He understood my complicated family history without judgment. When I shared my painful memories with him, he simply listened and supported me. "You didn't get to choose your family, but none of that is your fault. The family we create together will be your true home." His words warmed my heart. For the first time, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. With Don, I learned what happiness is. Our life together is irreplaceable. But I've never told my family about him. I didn't want to invite negativity into our lives. However, news of my marriage somehow reached my family. 3 days after the cake incident, my mother called me unexpectedly. "I heard you got married. Why didn't you tell us something so important?" I paused, surprised by her question, but I responded calmly. "I didn't think it was necessary to tell you." Silence hung on the other end of the line. "Fine, do whatever you want. You'll end up alone anyway." Her words didn't hurt me this time. In a way, I expected them. Instead, I felt reassured by how happy I was with my new life. I wasn't alone. I had Don and the family we were building together. "Family, that won't last." I brushed off her words. I am happy now. No matter what she says, it won't change anything. That phone call marked the final break between us. But just 3 days later, something shocking happened. The doorbell rang unexpectedly. When I opened the door, Amy was standing there. How did she know my address? Still, I invited her in. "What are you doing here?" "I just wanted to see what kind of guy you married." Her voice had a playful tone, but I felt uneasy. Amy had no reason to visit unless she had an ulterior motive. As soon as she entered the living room, her eyes locked on Don. "So this is your husband. Not bad at all. How did someone like you snag him?" I stayed silent, feeling my anger simmering. Don, however, remained composed. "I'm Sherry's husband. Please stop with the unnecessary remarks." Amy looked momentarily surprised by his directness, but quickly recovered. She stepped closer to Don, reaching out with a sickly sweet smile. "Don't be so stiff. Let's have some fun. Sherry won't mind, will she?" I couldn't believe her audacity. But Don didn't waver. "I'm not interested. My happiness is with my wife. Please stop this behavior." I felt a wave of gratitude for Don's unwavering loyalty. Amy shrugged, her smile fading into a cold smirk. "Whatever. I don't care about your happiness anyway." Her flippant attitude made my decision clear. "You don't need people like her in your life, Sherry. For your sake and ours, it's best to cut ties." His words mirrored my own thoughts. Amy and the rest of my family had no place in our lives anymore. It was time to let go. After Amy's visit, I made an important decision. For years, I had been sending money to my family. I paid for Amy's tuition and even helped with the mortgage on their home. I did all this despite the way they treated me, hoping they'd someday accept me as part of the family. But after the incident with Amy, I realized I no longer owed them anything. I decided to stop the financial support immediately. When I told Don, he smiled gently and nodded. "That's the right choice, Sherry. You've done more than enough. Now it's time to focus on yourself." His words lifted a weight off my shoulders. Cutting off the money felt like reclaiming my freedom. I filed all the necessary paperwork and stopped the payments. For the first time, I felt a sense of relief. A month later, my peaceful routine was interrupted by loud banging on the door. I opened it to find my mother and Amy standing there furious. "Why didn't the tuition payment go through?" "The landlord is threatening eviction." Their accusations didn't surprise me. In fact, I had been expecting this confrontation. I took a deep breath and explained calmly. "I stopped the payments because I'm no longer responsible for you. I even sold the house to recover what I already paid." Their shocked faces were almost comical. "What do you mean you sold the house?" "You made it clear I'm not part of your family, so I have no obligation to support you." "But what about my tuition? I can't finish school without it." "That's your responsibility now, not mine. I won't fund a family that doesn't include me." "You can't do this. After everything I've done for you." "Done for me? You mean the years of neglect and cruelty? I owe you nothing. My decision is final." Mother and Amy tried to argue, but I stood firm. Their anger turned to desperation as they realized I wouldn't budge. "You'll regret this." "You're the worst sister ever." Their words didn't affect me anymore. I had finally let go of the hope that they would change. A week later, their harassment escalated. They showed up daily, shouting outside my home, and even contacting Don's parents. My in-laws were understanding but concerned. "They've crossed a line." "You need to take action before it gets worse." Don suggested we involve the police. At first, I hesitated, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I gathered evidence from our security camera and filed a report. The police treated it as a family matter and were slow to act, but I didn't give up. Finally, after another disruptive incident, they intervened. My mother and Amy were warned to stay away, but they didn't listen. Their behavior escalated until the police had no choice but to take further action. Both were issued formal restraining orders. The neighbors, tired of the constant noise, supported my case. Some even advised me to move away. Don agreed it was time to relocate. "Let's start fresh somewhere new." I couldn't have agreed more. We found a new home and moved quietly. Even after the move, my mother and Amy tried to track us down. They even showed up at Don's parents' home, but my father-in-law stood firm. "Sherry is part of our family now. If you have issues, they're your responsibility, not hers." My mother left angrily, but Amy tried begging my mother-in-law for help. "You made your bed, now lie in it." With their efforts failing, they eventually stopped trying. I finally felt free. After the harassment stopped, life became peaceful again. My mother and Amy's persistent interference had drained me emotionally, but now I could finally move on. Dawn and I settled into our new home, focusing on building a future together. The love and support from my in-laws strengthened my resolve to leave the past behind. They treated me like their own daughter, something I had never experienced before. "Sherry, your family, whatever happens, will always be here for you." Their words gave me a sense of security I had never known. Meanwhile, my mother and stepfather's relationship deteriorated further. Without my financial support, their fragile bond unraveled. Eventually, they divorced, and my mother lived a quiet, isolated life. Amy, too, faced the consequences of her actions. A potential marriage fell apart when her fiancé learned about her family background and past behavior. Left alone, Amy struggled to rebuild her life. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to feel pity. They had chosen this path through their actions and attitudes. My life with Dawn flourished as we grew closer through shared experiences. Together, we faced challenges and celebrated successes, always supporting each other. "We've been through so much, but look at where we are now." His words always reminded me how far I had come. One evening, as we sat in our cozy living room, Dawn took my hand. "Let's focus on our future. I want to make you as happy as you make me." His sincerity brought tears to my eyes. I finally felt like I belonged somewhere, with someone who truly cared for me. The shadows of my past no longer loomed over me. I had found my place in the world, a place where I was loved and valued. The peace and stability Dawn and I shared became the foundation for our happiness. Even as memories of my family occasionally resurfaced, they no longer had the power to hurt me. Dawn's family became the family I had always longed for. Their warmth and acceptance healed wounds I thought would never mend. For the first time, I felt free to live my life fully without fear or guilt. Dawn's father's words often echoed in my mind. "Family isn't just about blood. It's about the bonds you choose to nurture." Those bonds, I realized, were the ones I would cherish forever. Looking back, I saw my struggles with my mother and Amy as a painful but necessary part of my journey. They had taught me resilience and the value of true family. As Dawn and I moved forward, I knew I had finally found my home.
Ignored by husband at New Year's gathering, why is she here? Mill asks. I leave, and husband collapses.
"What a shameless daughter-in-law you are! How dare you show your face here without being invited? And this New Year's feast, my cooking is more than enough. You shouldn't have meddled." A dull thud echoed as the lacquered box of dishes I had carefully prepared fell to the floor. It was tossed from her hands. The delicacies I spent days crafting spilled across the tatami floor. I froze in place, staring at the scattered black beans and broken rolls. Just a week ago, I had been so excited to try my hand at New Year's dishes. I thought Amelia, my mother-in-law, might finally approve of me. She had tasked me with preparing dishes for the extended family. I saw it as a chance to gain her recognition. Night after night, I worked late into the evening, and yet the only sound now was the hollow clatter of beans scattering across the silent room. I glanced at Kenneth, my husband, seated nearby, casually scrolling on his phone. He didn't even look up as his wife was being insulted. My chest tightened. A coldness seeped into my heart. Slowly, I lowered myself to a kneeling position. I bowed deeply. "I'm sorry. I'll leave now." My voice trembled as I apologized. "Shameless! You think a simple apology will suffice after you stole my son from me?" I couldn't lift my head under the barrage of insults raining down on me. The words cut deeply. Tears welled up as regret and helplessness flooded over me. At that moment, the doorbell rang. It broke the tense silence. "Let me help you with those dishes, Jessica." A calm but firm voice made me look up. Standing in the entryway was a woman I didn't recognize. She was dressed impeccably and holding a single envelope. Little did I know, the contents of that envelope would reveal the darkness festering within this twisted family. My name is Jessica Porter. I work in sales at a major corporation. My career was flourishing,
A promotion was just around the corner, but in my personal life, I lived alone in the city. Despite being 28 years old, I shuffled between my apartment and office. Tonight, after another late night at work, I returned home to my quiet apartment. Eating a late dinner, I checked my personal phone. It buzzed with a notification. I sighed deeply. I opened a message from a high school friend. They asked me to give a speech at their upcoming wedding. Recently, many of my old friends have been sharing happy news about engagements and weddings. It's been a nonstop wedding rush. Even my college and work friends have joined the bandwagon. I can't help but feel a vague sense of unease. And this latest message from my high school friend felt like the final straw. That's when I decided I needed to start seriously thinking about marriage. With that resolve, I signed up for a matchmaking party. At one such party, I met a man who stood out to me. His name was Kenneth Miller. He was a 30-year-old systems engineer at a prominent IT company. Kenneth, like me, had been consumed by work and found little time to date. He shared how his family had been urging him to settle down, so he reluctantly attended the matchmaking event. I felt an instant connection with Kenneth. Unlike the assertive colleagues I was used to, he was gentle and soft-spoken. I was captivated by his calm demeanor and kindness. I thought with Kenneth, I could build a warm, loving home. I pursued him enthusiastically. A few months later, we promised to marry. Our relationship progressed smoothly. I introduced him to my parents first. Later, it was time to meet his family.
My mom's a bit overbearing, but she means well. Please don't be put off.
Kenneth's warning did little to prepare me for my first meeting with his mother. She greeted me with a bright smile, but her eyes betrayed a sharp coldness. I felt an instant hostility, as though she disapproved of me. Kenneth's father was notably absent. I found it odd for such an important meeting. Kenneth explained that his father had been away on long-term assignments for most of his childhood. Kenneth grew up in a household dominated by his mother.
Jessica, if you're marrying Kenneth, you'll, of course, quit your job and become a full-time homemaker, won't you?
Her question caught me off guard. I had no intention of leaving my career. Kenneth and I had already discussed this. He seemed supportive of my decision. I glanced at Kenneth for reassurance.
Oh, Mom, I should have told you earlier. Jessica's planning to keep working.
Absolutely not. If she's joining the Miller family, she must serve her husband. Her hands slammed against the table. The sound startled me. Kenneth suddenly dropped to the floor. He prostrated himself before his mother, crying.
I'm sorry, Mom. It's my fault for not setting things straight with her. Please forgive her.
Oh, Kenneth, you poor thing. You're not to blame. She gently stroked his back.
The one at fault here is her. Jessica, if you don't quit your job, I will not approve of this marriage.
Her words shook me. I stammered out a response. I'll try to meet your expectations. That was all I could manage. I left their house with a heavy heart. On the way home, I replayed the events in my mind. Should I prioritize my career or my relationship? I thought about my parents' happy expressions during our first meeting. They had been thrilled about my engagement. If I chose work over marriage, it would crush them. In my hometown, traditional beliefs about a woman's happiness through marriage still ran deep. With that in mind, I made a decision. I would leave my job to marry Kenneth. Looking back, it was the worst decision I could have made. But at the time, I was desperate to fulfill everyone's expectations. It was the beginning of a long and painful journey. Our wedding was extravagant, orchestrated by Kenneth's family. However, the joy of the day was overshadowed by his mother's cold, piercing glares. Her looks felt like venomous snakes coiling around my heart. I sensed my marriage would be tumultuous. Unfortunately, my intuition was spot on. Kenneth and his mother's relationship remained unsettling. I often felt like an outsider in their bond. Our new home was just 15 minutes from his mother's house. She insisted on visiting frequently. What began as monthly visits soon turned into daily calls and unannounced drop-ins. I pleaded with Kenneth to talk to her. His responses were always dismissive.
She's just lonely without Dad around. Besides, she's helping you with the household chores, isn't she? You should be grateful.
With that, he brushed off my concerns. His mother, a lifelong homemaker, had exacting standards for domestic tasks. Meanwhile, I had been used to focusing on my career. She scrutinized everything I did.
Jessica, you must create a comfortable home for Kenneth. He works hard to provide for you, so it's your duty.
Her constant criticisms wore me down. She even belittled my cooking. Cooking had been my pride and joy. I used to share recipes on social media where they received rave reviews.
These dishes are nothing special.
Her words chipped away at my confidence. Within 6 months, I had lost my will to argue. I began to believe I was at fault.
You've never taken homemaking seriously, have you? I can't accept you as Kenneth's wife.
I'm sorry, Heather. She left satisfied after each scolding session. One day, my sister-in-law Yvonne visited unexpectedly. I'm sorry to intrude, Jessica, but I have something important to share. Her somber expression filled me with unease. Is something wrong? I've noticed discrepancies in Kenneth's paycheck deposits. Yvonne managed the family's business's finances. She knew Kenneth's salary details. Her words alarmed me. Kenneth says he's working late on a big project, and he gives me an allowance every month. I see. She fell silent, her face clouded with concern. Let me investigate further. Her tone was serious. As she left, I felt a growing unease. Kenneth had been distant lately. He often worked late or secluded himself in his office. Conversations between us had become rare. I couldn't help but feel that Yvonne's concerns were connected to his behavior. I also noticed his mother had been unusually absent. Days passed, and the unease in my heart grew stronger. Then one day, Kenneth's mother called me.
Jessica, I assume you've been keeping yourself busy. For this New Year's, we're hosting relatives, and I want you to prepare the traditional dishes.
You want me to cook for everyone?
5 servings should suffice.
I'd be happy to.
Don't embarrass me.
Her words stung, but I saw this as an opportunity. If I could impress her with my cooking, perhaps she would finally accept me. I poured my heart into preparing the dishes. I practiced and refined every recipe, working late into the night. By New Year's, I had created a spread I was proud of. On the big day, I arrived at Kenneth's family home with the food. Yvonne greeted me warmly. Oh, Jessica, this looks amazing. You've outdone yourself. Her words filled me with relief and hope. But Kenneth's mother was unimpressed.
Why is she here? And what is this mess you've brought?
She glared at me with disdain. Before I could respond, she picked up the tray of food and threw it to the ground. Dishes I had painstakingly prepared were now scattered across the floor. My heart sank. Kenneth sat in the corner, glued to his phone. He didn't look up, didn't say a word. Tears welled up in my eyes as I knelt to clean up the mess. I turned to Kenneth's mother and bowed deeply. I'm sorry. I'll leave now.
You think a simple apology will fix this? You're nothing but a failure who stole my son.
Her words cut deep. I fought back tears, ashamed of my weakness. Then the doorbell rang. Yvonne walked in, holding a large envelope. Good afternoon, everyone. I need to speak with all of you. Her calm yet firm tone commanded attention. Kenneth's mother stiffened. Yvonne's presence seemed to unsettle her. Jessica, please sit down. I hesitated, but complied. Kenneth, there's something I need to address. Kenneth finally looked up, his face pale. I reviewed the company's financial records, and I found some serious discrepancies. Kenneth's expression turned to panic. Would you care to explain where the missing funds have gone?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Don't lie to me. The evidence is clear. And you, Amelia, knew about this, didn't you? She turned to Kenneth's mother, whose face was now flushed with anger.
How dare you accuse me?
I'm not accusing you. I have proof. She pulled out the envelope and placed it on the table. This contains detailed records of Kenneth's financial misconduct and Amelia's involvement in covering it up. The room fell silent. Kenneth and his mother were visibly shaken. I sat there, stunned, as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The weight of Yvonne's words filled the room with tension.
This is a misunderstanding.
Is it? Then why do these bank transfers lead back to your personal account?
I can explain.
Kenneth's voice trembled, but Yvonne's piercing gaze silenced him. You've been stealing from the company, Kenneth. And Amelia, you've been helping him.
Kenneth's mother stood abruptly. That's enough. This is our family's business. It's none of your concern.
It became my concern the moment it threatened the company's stability. Yvonne's firm tone left no room for argument. Kenneth slumped into his chair, defeated. His mother glared at Yvonne, but she said nothing further. I remained silent, overwhelmed by the revelations. Jessica, you deserve better than this. Kenneth and Amelia's actions don't define you. Don't let them manipulate you into thinking otherwise. Yvonne's words struck a chord in me. For the first time in years, I felt seen. I turned to Kenneth, who avoided my gaze. Is this true? Kenneth didn't respond. Jessica, you need to make a decision. Are you going to stay in this toxic environment? Or are you going to reclaim your life? The room was silent as everyone awaited my response. I took a deep breath, mustering the courage to speak. I'm done. I've tried to earn your approval, Amelia, but it's clear that I'll never be good enough for you. And Kenneth, I can't believe the person I thought I loved would betray me like this. I'm leaving.
How dare you? You think you can just walk away?
I stood, looking her directly in the eye. Watch me. With that, I turned and walked out of the house. Yvonne followed me, offering her support. You're stronger than you know, Jessica. This is the first step toward a better life. I nodded, grateful for her kindness. As I left the house, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I was free. Yvonne helped me into her car, offering a supportive smile as I buckled my seatbelt. Let's get you somewhere safe and quiet. Thank you, Yvonne. I don't know what I'd do without you right now. The drive was silent, but it was a comforting silence. Yvonne dropped me off at a small apartment she had arranged through a friend. Take your time to settle in. You're not alone, Jessica. Her words were reassuring, and I felt a flicker of hope. The apartment was cozy, with sunlight streaming through the windows. As I sat on the couch, letting the reality of my decision sink in, for the first time in years, I was alone, not lonely, but free. Over the following weeks, I worked with a lawyer to finalize the divorce. Kenneth tried to reach out several times, but I didn't answer. I wasn't interested in his excuses or apologies. My lawyer assured me that the evidence Yvonne gathered would ensure a fair settlement. During this time, I also reconnected with old friends. I had distanced myself from them during my marriage, but they welcomed me back with open arms. Their support reminded me of who I was before Kenneth and his mother's influence. Yvonne continued to check in on me regularly. How are you feeling today? Better. It's strange, but I feel lighter. That's a good sign. Yvonne smiled, her kindness and strength unwavering. As the weeks turned into months, I began to rebuild my life. I found a job at a marketing firm, something I had always been passionate about. It felt empowering to rely on myself again. On a sunny afternoon, I signed the final divorce papers.
Congratulations, Jessica. You're officially free.
I smiled, feeling a surge of relief and closure. That evening, I celebrated with Yvonne and my closest friends. To new beginnings. To Jessica's future. The toast felt like a declaration of my newfound independence. Kenneth and his mother no longer held power over me. The life I was creating was my own. As I lay in bed that night, I reflected on my journey. It had been painful, but it had also been transformative. I finally understood what Yvonne had meant when she said I deserved better. I did deserve better, and now I was living it. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose and a smile on my face. This was the start of a new chapter, one I was determined to write on my own terms.
Invited to celebrate my firstborn, Mill says it's a family-only event and locks me out. So I cut all support and watch their downfall.
Welcome! So glad you could make it. When I arrived at my in-laws' house to celebrate my first child's birth, my mother-in-law greeted me with excitement. But as I stepped forward to enter, she suddenly shut the door in my face. "You stay out here. Today is a family-only celebration." With those words, she locked the door with a click. I was stunned, unsure of what had just happened. Then it hit me. She didn't consider me family. From the start, she had only planned to exclude me as a way to spite me. How petty could they possibly be? Furious, I decided to stop any financial support we had been giving them, and soon they found themselves in big trouble. My name is Emma, a 32-year-old working professional expecting my first child soon. 2 years ago, I married my husband, Mark, and we've been living at my mother's house since. My father passed away a few years ago, and I didn't want to leave my mother alone. Mark agreed, understanding my concerns. "I'm still healthy, Emma. You and Mark could live on your own. Isn't this arrangement too much for Mark?" Although she initially declined, she soon agreed to let us stay together. Being an only child, I have felt responsible for caring for my mom after my father passed. While my mother is still in her 60s and healthy, I was worried about the future. What if something happened to her? Mark understood my feelings and agreed to live with her. "My family home is being handled by my sister. Don't worry about it. Living here will help us save on rent too." Hearing him say that made me happy. Mark's family included his parents and sister, but we rarely visited. Whenever I suggested visiting his family, Mark wasn't enthusiastic. "I don't really want to go back. If anything important comes up, they'll call." My mother would urge him to visit his family, but he always responded with vague promises. When we got engaged, Mark explained that his parents had remarried, bringing children from previous marriages. Mark's biological mother passed away when he was in elementary school. His father remarried 2 years later under pressure from relatives. Honestly, I didn't need a new mom. Mark shared this with a wry smile, hinting at unresolved tensions. When we first visited his family to announce our engagement, my mother-in-law seemed friendly. "Emma, we've been waiting for you. Please take good care of Mark." She appeared kind, which put me at ease. However, Mark's sister, Lily, greeted me with hostility. "So you're here for Dad's money, aren't you? Don't think for a second that you'll get your hands on it." I was shocked by her sudden accusation. Mark's father, Brian, quickly scolded her. "That's enough. We're not discussing inheritance right now." The sister stormed off, and my mother-in-law apologized profusely. "I'm so sorry. She's just upset because her younger brother is getting married first." I later learned that Mark's sister was single. Despite the awkwardness, Brian and Heather seemed supportive of our marriage. However, Mark remained distant toward Heather, which puzzled me. My mom was acting completely different in front of you. If you knew her true nature, you'd be shocked. As we left his family home, Mark looked tense and said something that made my heart sink. "Emma, my mom doesn't approve of our marriage deep down. She just doesn't want me around Dad. She's worried about his inheritance." Mark's words helped me understand the underlying tensions. Mark's father owned a company, but Mark had chosen a completely unrelated career path. When Mark moved out after getting a job, his stepmother made her feelings clear. Now that Mark has moved out, we won't be helping him financially anymore. Honestly, I'd ask for the tuition money we paid back if I could. Mark explained that his father had paid for his education, not his stepmother. But she always acted as if she had. She complained about him constantly behind his father's back. Mark said he wasn't bothered by her complaints, but I couldn't help feeling uneasy. After our marriage was finalized, both families gathered for a formal meeting. A company-owning family like ours and a single-parent household like Emma's, the gap is simply too big. But Mark insisted, so we're reluctantly approving this marriage. "Once you take Mark, don't bother staying in touch with us. I'm all Dad needs." My mother stayed calm and polite, but I could feel her discomfort. Just as we were about to respond, she suddenly stopped us with a glance. When Mark's father entered the room, my mother-in-law's demeanor changed entirely. "Oh, Emma and Mark are such a perfect couple. Mark's late mother must be so happy for them." She wore a bright smile that felt completely insincere. Mark grew silent, his expression grim. After the meeting, my mother shared her candid thoughts. "Mark's stepmother and sister are quite something, but it's a relief they don't want to stay in contact." My mother was right. Cutting ties with them felt like a blessing. Even Mark's father told him he didn't need to visit the family home. For the first 6 months of our marriage, life was peaceful. But then, Mark's father fell seriously ill. We rushed to the hospital after hearing he'd been taken there in an ambulance. When we arrived, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law looked visibly annoyed. "I wish he just passed away. He's so stubborn. The office shouldn't have called an ambulance. They really shouldn't have bothered." Hearing them talk like this made my blood boil. But before I could say anything, Mark intervened. Are you seriously wishing for Dad to die? That would break his heart if he knew. His mother and sister glared at us before leaving in a huff. We went to check on his father and were relieved to see he had regained consciousness. I bet those two are upset I'm still alive. I'll recover, if only to spite them. Despite his humor, his condition left him partially paralyzed and in need of care. I voiced my concerns to Mark later. His mother and sister wouldn't take care of his father, and I worried they might harm him instead. Mark agreed and decided to arrange for his father to stay in a facility. With his assets, Mark's father could afford a high-quality care facility, and we felt relieved. Caregiving is the daughter-in-law's duty. Emma should look after him. Mark immediately grabbed the phone from me and responded sharply. You told us not to contact you, remember? Why are you calling Emma now? If you're putting him in a facility, Mark should pay for it. Don't expect a penny from me. Furious at her selfishness, Mark hung up the phone. His father's decision to entrust Mark with financial control proved wise, as it shielded his assets from his stepmother's grasp. With the arrangements finalized, his father moved into a well-equipped care facility. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law were fuming. Where's the passbook with the rest of the money? The company isn't paying anymore, so what are we supposed to do? You still have the house and some savings. Figure it out yourselves. Her complaints grew louder. Mark, you're controlling all the money, aren't you? Hand it over now. Mark refused and ended the call. The next thing we knew, both women showed up at our home. Let Mark out here now. I demand control of my husband's finances. Her shouting startled me, but my mother stepped in. Mark isn't home, but perhaps you'd like to visit your husband instead? You've never visited him at the facility. This could be your chance. Why would I bother doing something so inconvenient? Stay out of this. My mother didn't back down, and they left grumbling. When Mark returned and heard what had happened, he shook his head in frustration. They're so used to living off others that they can't adjust. Despite being given money, they squandered it within months. It became clear they had no intention of changing their ways. When their demands continued, Mark firmly decided to cut them off financially. My mother supported his decision, believing it was necessary for their independence. The strain only worsened when Mark's father's health began to decline. His stepmother and stepsister never visited, despite being informed. Instead, they eagerly awaited his passing, hoping to claim an inheritance. When his father eventually passed away, they were still nowhere to be seen. During the funeral preparations, Mark insisted we keep his mother and sister in the dark. They don't deserve to be part of this. I understood his feelings but felt conflicted. As expected, they learned of his passing through others. The day after the funeral, they arrived at our door, furious. Why didn't you tell us? We have a right to know. Mark didn't hesitate to respond. You've made it clear you care more about his money than about him. We didn't want you there. Furious, they demanded their inheritance. We're his family. We're entitled to his assets. Mark calmly revealed the truth. You have no claim. Dad divorced you before he passed away. And since you refused to legally adopt me, there's no familial tie either. Both women were speechless. Their faces turned red with anger as they began shouting accusations. This is your fault. You tricked him into divorcing me. Mark didn't back down. You signed the divorce papers years ago. Don't blame me for your mistakes. Realizing they had no leverage, they stormed off in frustration. From then on, we didn't hear from them again. With his father's estate settled, Mark and I focused on our new family. Our son became the light of our lives, and we found peace, free from the chaos of his stepmother and stepsister. Months passed peacefully, and we finally felt the weight of the past lifting off our shoulders. Mark remained committed to managing his father's inheritance responsibly, ensuring it was preserved for our son's future. Despite the hardships, we focused on building a happy life, cherishing the little moments with our son. Just when we thought everything had settled, we received an unexpected visitor. Did you hear about those two women? Mark and I exchanged glances, unsure who they meant. Your stepmother and stepsister. They've gotten themselves into quite the mess. Curious, Mark asked for details. They were caught up in some kind of scam, borrowed money from loan sharks and got tricked by con artists promising marriage. Last I heard, they were trying to avoid being taken overseas by the people they owe. The news shocked us both. though it wasn't entirely unexpected given their history. It's sad, but they brought it on themselves. Despite their actions, part of me couldn't help but feel pity. They had always sought easy solutions, only to dig themselves into deeper trouble. We later learned they had been taken abroad to repay their debts. From that moment on, we heard nothing more about them. Life moved on, and our focus remained on our son and the life we were building together. Mark often spoke of his father, reflecting on the lessons he had learned from him. Dad would want us to live responsibly and happily. He'd be proud of what we've achieved. Hearing him say that filled me with gratitude for the family we had created. Though our journey had been turbulent, it had made us stronger and more determined to provide a stable future for our son. We knew we couldn't change the past, but we could reshape the future, ensuring it was free of the chaos we had endured.
After my husband's funeral, son and wife laugh. We'll take all the inheritance. You get nothing. Me, go ahead. But actually,
Get out of this mansion immediately. Trash belongs in the trash can. That's the rule of the world.
My son's words pierced through me, making my body tremble. The child I raised with all my heart and effort stood in front of his father's house with a look of full disdain for me. My vision went black. Memories of him as a child flashed before my eyes, holding his small hand as he suffered through a fever all night, watching him tie his shoes for the first time and saying, "Mom, I did it," with a shining smile. His smile was my everything. Where did that innocent smile disappear to? The reality of being called trash by the son I cherished so deeply was too painful to bear. I almost collapsed onto my knees. As murmurs of discomfort spread through the gathered relatives, my daughter-in-law smirked coldly. "Mother, please pack your things and leave. Everything in this house is now ours." Her cruel declaration shattered 30 years' worth of memories in an instant. The sleepless nights spent nursing my sick husband Brian, juggling part-time jobs to pay for my son's education. And yet, my son now calls it all garbage. Ken reached for his father's urn, grabbed it disrespectfully, and threw it on the floor. The sound of it hitting the ground felt like it ripped through my soul. Even Brian's final memento was desecrated this way. Trembling, I picked up the urn from the floor and held it to my chest. Their crude, mocking laughter stabbed into my ears. My love for my son was being broken into pieces. Silently, I closed my eyes and clutched an envelope hidden in my coat. I looked up at my late husband's house, and our final conversation came back to me. If only I had been a stronger wife. As I whispered those words, a visitor approached. Quickly wiping my tears, I turned to see a man leaning in to whisper into my ear. "My name is Mary James. I'm 55 years old, and I was married to Brian for 30 years. A year ago, Brian was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. Throughout our long marriage, this past year brought me closer to him than ever before. Watching his pained expression as I sat by his bedside, my emotions constantly battled within me. One feeling was a sense of relief, that the tumultuous years of our marriage were coming to an end. The other was confusion, wondering where the kind, loving man I had married had gone. The doctors told me he didn't have long, so I reached out to those close to him. Yet not a single person came to visit. His own mother, his biological son, even his mistress, who sent frequent messages to his phone. When our son was born, Brian began staying out late and eventually stopped coming home. He returned only with the scent of woman's perfume lingering on his clothes. He would casually profess to love other women on the phone, even in front of me and Ken. Meanwhile, he treated me with disdain, showing no appreciation for my efforts. The once doting husband who brought flowers on anniversaries and gifts on my birthdays was gone. Over time, he stopped showing affection to me altogether. Instead, he lavished gifts on other women, leaving me feeling abandoned and betrayed. For 27 years, my marriage was overshadowed by the constant presence of other women. Brian's insults about my appearance and behavior became a daily occurrence. His passing brought a quiet end to this painful chapter of my life. When I watched him take his last breath, I felt a strange sense of relief. The funeral was busy, but amidst it all, I knew I would no longer have to endure his criticisms. At the funeral, Heather, my mother-in-law, wasted no time in expressing her disdain. "You'll live off your late husband's inheritance now, won't you? Must be nice to have it so easy. If he hadn't married someone like you, maybe he would have lived longer." Her words didn't bother me anymore. After all, my ties with her would soon be severed for good. I bowed deeply and offered her my apologies to avoid a long tirade. "I'm sorry for being such an inadequate daughter-in-law." Satisfied with my apology, she responded with a condescending smile. "Well, I'm sure you'll be helping with my care in the future, as the Yamada family's daughter-in-law." Her entourage of sycophantic relatives chuckled around her, enjoying the spectacle. These people only stuck around her for financial and social benefits. I couldn't imagine any of them staying to help her when things got difficult. With her nearing 100 years old, and no real bond with anyone, her future seemed lonely. I had no intention of being part of that future. The house we lived in would eventually be handed down to others, and I planned to leave it behind. The nightmare of a marriage was finally over. My poor relationship with my in-laws began right after my family went bankrupt. My family used to be well off, running a traditional Japanese confectionery business. My father's craftsmanship was renowned, but his poor business sense brought the business to ruin. My parents hid their financial struggles, presenting themselves as wealthy, which led to my arranged marriage. At first, my in-laws treated me kindly, seeing me as a daughter of a successful family. But everything changed when a newspaper article revealed my family's bankruptcy. I returned home to find creditors banging on our door and angry signs plastered everywhere. That day, my parents disappeared without a trace, leaving me to face the fallout alone. When I returned to my marital home, Brian greeted me with anger.
"You tricked me into marrying you."
He threw a newspaper at me, calling me a fraud.
"Do you know how much damage this does to my family's reputation?"
I apologized, tears streaming down my face, but he walked away, muttering about being stuck with a poor wife. Heather called shortly after, berating me. "You're a useless fraud just like your parents." I became an outcast in my new family, but everything changed when I became pregnant with Ken. He was my hope, my light in the darkness. At first, even Brian was involved in parenting. But as Ken grew older, Brian's infidelity worsened. Despite his father's behavior, Ken was a sweet, understanding child who tried to defend me. However, as he entered his teenage years, he began to take after his father.
"Where's dinner? Hurry up, you old hag."
By the time Ken was in middle school, he was rebellious and difficult. He clashed frequently with his father, and I often bore the brunt of their arguments. Despite his flaws, Brian insisted on giving Ken money, believing it was the only way to show his love. Ken quickly became spoiled, using his money to buy friends who cared little for him. By high school, Ken had grown into a selfish, entitled young man. After graduating, he moved to the city, attending a university where entry required little more than signing your name. Even as an adult, Ken relied on financial support from his father. When his father fell ill, Ken showed no interest in visiting despite my pleas. On his deathbed, Brian whispered that he wanted to see Ken one last time, but that wish was never fulfilled. Ken's absence was heartbreaking, but I focused on caring for Brian in his final days. The funeral went as planned, and the guests eventually departed. Just as I was beginning to feel some peace, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Ken and his wife Amy stood before me. It had been 5 years since I last saw Ken, and my heart raced at the sight of him. No matter how strained our relationship had become, he was still the child I had given birth to. With an unreadable expression, Ken entered the house, followed closely by Amy, who gave me a cold, piercing glare. There was something unsettling about their demeanor. Despite my unease, I guided them to the living room. "I'll bring some tea."
"Don't bother. Sit down."
His tone was curt, almost hostile, and reminded me of his father. I sat across from him, feeling the weight of the tension in the air.
"I've already transferred all of Dad's inheritance into my name."
The sudden announcement left me speechless. Brian's estate included large plots of land, mountains, and several properties. I had never managed or even thought about these assets, and the news caught me off guard. "What do you mean?"
"Everything. This house, the vacation homes, the properties, they're all mine now."
Amy chimed in, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Isn't it incredible, Ken? If you sold the land, you could make a fortune." Amy then turned to me with a look of contempt.
"Shut up, Amy."
Ken's sudden outburst startled Amy, who immediately apologized with a nervous smile. His behavior was so similar to his father that it sent a shiver down my spine. Ken continued speaking, ignoring Amy's discomfort.
"All the paperwork is done."
He pulled out a stack of documents and spread them on the table. One of the papers was a deed showing the transfer of ownership of Brian's property to Ken. "How did you manage to do this?" Ken smirked, looking proud of himself.
"Dad's mistress helped me. She gave me the code to his safe."
His words struck me like a bolt of lightning. Brian had shared the safe's code with his mistress, betraying even his final privacy. Ken looked at me with disdain.
"Dad didn't want some greedy old woman like you getting any of his money."
My throat tightened, and I struggled to find the words to respond. The son I thought would never abandon me had sided with the person who had hurt me most. My anger and sorrow boiled over, tears streaming down my face. "Do whatever you want." My voice was calm. My words surprised even me. Ken and Amy exchanged smug glances, thinking they had won. They left, confident that they had taken everything from me. The next day, I went to a real estate agency to find a new place to live. I couldn't stay in this house any longer. At the agency, I met a kind employee who quickly found a small apartment that met my needs. The landlord, Mrs. Tanaka, used to work in public service. She's very understanding. When I met Mrs. Tanaka, she welcomed me warmly and offered her support. "I've been through a tough marriage, too. If you ever need help, just let me know." Her kindness brought tears to my eyes. I moved into her apartment complex, a cozy and quiet place where I finally began to feel at peace. 3 months later, life had settled into a calm routine. One morning, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. When I opened the door, Ken and Amy stood there, looking uneasy. "What are you doing here?"
"We need your help, Mom."
They bowed their heads, a gesture I had never expected from them. I let them in, curious about what could have driven them to this. After sitting down, Ken confessed everything.
"The properties I inherited are worthless. They're either overgrown or require expensive demolition."
His voice wavered as he explained their financial troubles. For the first time in years, Ken looked genuinely vulnerable. "I'll help you figure this out." His relief was palpable, and Amy thanked me profusely. A few days later, we visited several of the properties to assess the situation. Many were in terrible condition, and the cost to fix them were staggering. By the end of the day, Ken seemed exhausted. I hadn't seen him like this since he was a child. Despite everything, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope for our relationship. When I returned home that evening, my apartment had been ransacked. My savings, important documents, and valuables were all gone. The betrayal was too familiar. The next few days revealed the truth. Ken and Amy had organized the theft. This time, however, I had evidence. Mrs. Tanaka's security cameras captured everything. "Don't worry, Mary. The police are already on their way." Mrs. Tanaka's support gave me strength. Ken and Amy were arrested, and I finally began to rebuild my life. 6 months later, I joined Mrs. Tanaka in running a support group for others who had faced hardship. Helping others gave me purpose, and I finally found peace. For the first time in years, I could look ahead and smile. Months passed and life settled into a peaceful rhythm in Mrs. Tanaka's apartment complex. I had fully immersed myself in our community support group, meeting people with stories just as challenging as mine. One day, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. The sender was Ken. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope, unsure of what to expect.
Mom, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. Amy and I went too far, and we're paying the price for our actions. The time I spent in jail gave me a lot to think about. I realize now how much you've sacrificed for me, and I'm sorry for everything I've done to hurt you.
His words were a small but significant step toward redemption. I wasn't ready to forgive him completely, but I appreciated his attempt to reach out. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. For now, I chose to focus on the positive aspects of my life. Mrs. Tanaka and I expanded the support group, organizing workshops and events to help more people. One sunny afternoon, we hosted an outdoor picnic for the residents of the complex. "Mary, look at how far you've come. You're an inspiration to everyone here." Her words filled me with gratitude. I smiled, thinking about how much had changed in such a short time. Later that day, a new resident arrived, a young woman who seemed nervous and unsure. Her name was Emily, and she was fleeing a toxic relationship. Seeing her reminded me of myself when I first moved in. "You're safe here, Emily. If you ever need help, don't hesitate to come to me or Mrs. Tanaka." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. That evening, I reflected on my journey. I had gone from being a broken woman at the mercy of others to someone who could offer support and kindness to others. The pain of losing Ken and Amy's trust still lingered, but I had learned to let go. Their actions no longer defined me or my future. I had found a new family in the people around me, a family built on compassion and understanding. As I prepared for bed, I looked out the window at the moonlit complex. It was quiet, peaceful, and full of potential. For the first time in years, I felt truly content. This was my home, and this was my life.